already has you feeling something. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Emma had known something was wrong for months, not the kind of wrong that announces itself, not arguments that shook the walls, or silences so cold they cracked the air between two people. It was quieter than that. Smaller. The kind of wrong that lived in the margins, a husband who came home after dark without explanation, who stopped asking how her day had gone, who sat beside her at the supper table and looked straight through her like she was already a memory. He was trying to forget. She had told herself it was exhaustion, the pressures of business, the heat of a Wyoming summer that made everyone short-tempered and restless. She had told herself a lot of things because the alternative that the man she had married at 18 years old had simply stopped loving her was a truth she hadn't found the courage to stand inside of yet. On the morning of July the 11th, 1886, Emma woke early as she always did. She started the fire in the kitchen stove. She put water on for coffee. She pressed her palms flat against the countertop and watched the pale light come through the window and thought that today somehow felt different. She didn't know how right she was. Richard came downstairs dressed in his good shirt, the white one with the pressed collar he only wore to church or to meetings with men he was trying to impress. He didn't look at her when he came into the kitchen. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the far end of the room with his back half turned toward her, and he drank it like she wasn't there. "You're going somewhere?" Emma asked. "Into town." "I'll come with you. I need flour and—" "Don't." She stopped. That single word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. "Richard, I said don't, Emma." He set his cup down on the counter. He still wasn't looking at her. "There's something I need to do today, and I don't want you there when I do it. But you're going to hear about it regardless, so—" He turned then. And for just a moment, she saw something cross his face that might have been guilt, or might have been relief. She would spend a long time afterward trying to decide which it was. "So, it's better you hear it from me first." The kitchen went very quiet. "I'm ending this marriage." Emma felt the words hit her chest. Not like a blow. Like something being removed. Like a splinter she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there, and now someone had pulled it free and left an open wound in its place. "I'm sorry," she said. And she hated herself for saying it, because she had nothing to be sorry for. "What did you just—" "I've spoken to a lawyer. The marriage can be dissolved. The homestead on the edge of Harlow Creek goes to you, the one my uncle left me, the one we never did anything with. You'll have a roof over your head. I'm not leaving you with nothing." "You're—" She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "You're leaving me." "Yes." "For someone else." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way he suddenly found the window behind her very interesting. "Who is she?" Emma said. It wasn't a question. It came out level. Steady. She surprised herself. "Her name is Victoria Hale. Her father owns—" "I know who her father is." Everyone in Harlow County knew who Gerald Hale was. Railroad money. New money, the kind that made old ranching families nervous. Gerald Hale had arrived 2 years ago with blueprints and promises, and enough cash to buy goodwill from half the businessmen in town. His daughter Victoria had arrived with him 22 years old, yellow-haired, the kind of beautiful that made men forget what they'd been saying. Emma had never worried about Victoria Hale. That she understood now had been a spectacular mistake. "How long?" she said. "Emma. How long, Richard?" He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. 7 months. 7 months. The number settled over her like snow. Quiet, weightless, and yet somehow capable of burying everything underneath it. 7 months of her cooking his suppers and mending his shirts and lying awake beside him in the dark, wondering what she was doing wrong, what she could do differently, how she could be better. 7 months of blaming herself for a marriage that was already over. "Get out," she said. "Emma, I told you the homestead. Get out of my kitchen, Richard. Get out of this house. Go do whatever you're planning to do in town, and don't speak to me again until it's done through lawyers." He left. He didn't apologize. He didn't hesitate. He put on his hat, walked through the front door, and closed it behind him without a sound. Emma stood in her kitchen for a very long time. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure she was capable of it yet. She just stood there with the coffee going cold on the stove, and the morning light shifting across the floor, and something inside her cracking open slowly and completely, like earth splitting before a flood. Cowboy. She found out later that he had made the announcement in front of the Harlow Creek General Store. That was the part that people couldn't stop talking about afterward. Not that Richard Caldwell had left his wife, because men did that. God knows men had always done that, but that he had done it publicly. That he had stood in the middle of Main Street on a Tuesday morning with half the town as his audience and declared his intentions like he was posting a notice on the community board. He had arrived with Victoria Hale on his arm. He had walked straight to the center of the crowd that was always gathered there in the mornings. Ranchers waiting for the feed store to open. Women with market baskets. Old men on the bench outside the barber shop. And he had said loudly and clearly that his marriage to Emma Caldwell was finished, that he intended to wed Victoria Hale before the summer was out, and that anyone who had business dealings connected to the Caldwell name should know that those dealings would now run through him and the Hale family exclusively. He had made it sound like a business transaction, which Emma realized later was exactly what it was. Martha Givens. Emma's closest friend, a sharp-tongued schoolteacher's wife who never missed anything, had been standing near the feed store when it happened. She came to Emma that afternoon still flushed with the shock of it and told her everything. Every word. Every detail she'd managed to collect from people who'd been standing close enough to hear. "He had her on his arm like she was already his wife," Martha said. She couldn't sit still. She kept moving around Emma's kitchen, picking things up and setting them back down. Victoria Hale, standing right there on Main Street with that little smile on her face like she'd already decided how this ended. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't drunk any of. What did people say? What do you think they said? Half of them looked like they'd swallowed something unpleasant. The other half looked like they were already calculating what it meant for their own interests. Martha stopped moving and looked at her. "Emma, are you all right?" "I don't know yet." "That's honest, at least." "He took 7 months of my life," Emma said. 7 months when I thought I was the problem, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I needed to be different somehow, better. She looked down at her tea. 7 months of that, Martha. Martha sat down across from her and covered Emma's hands with her own. "You were not the problem." "I know that now." "Do you?" Emma looked up. And something shifted in her face. Something that Martha would describe later to her husband, to the women in her Sunday circle, to anyone who would listen over the months that followed. Something that settled. Something that hardened in the best possible way, the way iron hardens when it's been through fire. "I'm starting to," Emma said quietly. Within 3 days, the story had mutated into something barely recognizable. By Wednesday, people were saying that Emma had driven Richard away with her difficult temperament. By Thursday, that she'd never been suited to running a household. By Friday, a version was circulating that suggested Richard had been deeply unhappy for years, and that anyone who knew the couple had seen it coming. Emma had not driven Richard away. Emma had run the household they shared for 8 years. The cooking, the cleaning, the mending, the garden. The relationships with neighbors, the management of every domestic detail that Richard had never once thought about, because she had always handled it without complaint and without credit. But stories were easier when they had a villain. And Richard was popular. And Emma was the one who was left. So Emma became the villain of a story she hadn't written. She heard things in the market. She heard things at the dry goods store. She even heard from Martha that Richard himself had been telling people Emma had never been capable of managing on her own, that the small homestead he'd given her as a settlement was more charity than she deserved, and that most people expected her to sell it within the month and leave Harlow County entirely. Emma went home after hearing that, and stood in the yard of the neglected homestead on the edge of Harlow Creek, the one with the sagging fence and the drafty barn, and the well that barely pulled water, and the soil that had never been properly worked, and she looked at all of it for a long silent moment. Then she went inside and started making a list. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet. She didn't have money or experience running property alone, or any particular reason to believe she could make something out of this ruined little parcel of land that Richard had discarded along with her. What she had was stubbornness. What she had was 8 years of fury that had nowhere else to go. And what she had, though she didn't know it yet, was a decision she was not going to give Richard Caldwell the satisfaction of watching her disappear. She was going to stay, and she was going to build something he hadn't thought she was capable of building. She just didn't know how yet. The first time Emma met Luke Mercer, she was trying to fix a gate latch with a bent nail and a hammer that was too light for the job and losing the argument badly. She had seen him before, the way everyone in Harlow County had seen him, a tall, lean man who worked as foreman out at the Whitfield Ranch, who was known for being fair with his men and honest in his dealings and exceptionally difficult to read. He had a quiet kind of presence. The sort of man who didn't talk much in crowds, but who, when he did speak, had the strange effect of making the whole room settle down to listen. She didn't expect him to stop. He was riding past on his way back from town, and he stopped at the edge of her fence line and watched her fight with the gate latch for a moment without saying anything. Then he climbed down from his horse. "You're driving it at the wrong angle," he said. Emma looked up at him. "I beg your pardon." "The nail. You're driving it straight in, but the wood's warped so it won't hold. You need to angle it about 15 degrees to the right. It'll seat against the grain instead of fighting it." She stared at him. Then she looked down at the gate. Then she said, "Who taught you that?" "My father." He crouched down beside her to look at the latch more closely. "You want me to—" "No," she said immediately. "Show me how." He looked at her. Something flickered in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "All right," he said. "Watch where I put the angle." He guided her hand just slightly to adjust the position, not taking over, not stepping in, just redirecting. She drove the nail. It held. "That's it," she said. "That's it." She stood up and brushed the dust off her knees and looked at the gate standing solid where it had been swinging loose for 2 weeks. Then she looked at Luke Mercer. "I'm Emma Caldwell," she said. "I know who you are. And you're still standing here." He looked at her steadily. "Was I not supposed to be? Most people have been finding reasons to look the other direction lately." He glanced back toward town, then back at her. And he said simply, without any particular drama, the way a man says something he's already thought through. "Most people care more about Richard Caldwell's opinion than their own judgment. That's their problem, not yours." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "Luke Mercer," she said. "The foreman from Whitfield's place." "That's right. Thank you for the lesson with the gate." "You did the work yourself," he said. "I just pointed." He tipped his hat and went back to his horse. Emma watched him ride away and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The sensation of being seen clearly without pity, without agenda, without any of the murky calculation that had colored every interaction with her since Richard's announcement. Just seen. It was such a small thing, and it hit her so hard she had to press her hand against the gatepost to steady herself. That evening, Richard came by the homestead for the last time before the lawyers made everything official. He stood in the yard while Emma stood in the doorway, and he looked around at the cracked fence and the sagging barn and the dry earth and the house that needed a new window in the east wall, and he had the nerve to look almost sorry for her. "You don't have to stay here, you know," he said. "I'll write you a letter of character. You could find work in Cheyenne, or go back to your people in Ohio." "My people," Emma repeated. "Your mother's still living, isn't she?" "Your brother." "I'm not going to Ohio, Richard." He frowned. "Be reasonable. What are you going to do with this place? It's barely worth the land it's sitting on." "That's my concern," Emma said. "Emma, "You've done what you came to do," she said. "The lawyers will handle the rest. You don't need to worry yourself about where I go or what I do with what you've left me. That part of your life is finished." He stood there for a moment, and she could see him trying to decide whether to push further. Then he seemed to remember something, perhaps that he no longer had any authority here, had given it up the morning he walked out her front door, and he settled his hat on his head and turned to go. He paused once with his back to her. "I didn't think you'd be this way about it," he said. "What way?" "Stubborn." Emma looked at him, the set of his shoulders, the way he was carrying this whole thing, like it was some mild inconvenience rather than the life he had broken, and she felt something move through her. Not anger. Colder than anger. "Richard," she said, "the only thing I'm sorry about is that it took me this long to understand who you are." He left. Emma stood on her porch and watched him go, and this time she did not feel the weight of the marriage going with him. She felt something loosen. Something that had been wrapped around her chest for years, maybe longer than 7 months. Maybe longer than she wanted to admit. Just loosen. She went inside. She built up the fire. She went back to her list. It was Martha who told her what Luke Mercer had said on the day of Richard's announcement. Emma hadn't been there. She'd been home, but apparently, according to Martha, who had gotten it from the seamstress, who had gotten it from her husband, who had been standing 3 feet away when Richard had made his declaration in front of the general store, Luke Mercer had been standing at the edge of the crowd. He hadn't said anything during the announcement itself. He just stood there and listened with that unreadable expression of his. But afterward, when Richard and Victoria Hale had climbed into the Hale carriage and driven away, and the crowd had begun to break apart in a flurry of whispered commentary. Someone had made a remark. Emma never found out exactly who or exactly what they'd said. Something dismissive about how Richard had probably been right to move on, and Luke Mercer had turned and looked at the person who'd said it and said quietly and without heat, "A man who throws away loyalty never understands what he lost." And then he'd walked away. Martha reported this to Emma with the breathless emphasis of someone delivering very important intelligence. Emma listened to the whole account, and then she sat with it for a while. She didn't know what to make of Luke Mercer. She didn't know if she wanted to know what to make of him. She had enough to think about the fence, the barn, the well, that gave about half the water she needed. The list that kept growing every time she walked around her property. She didn't have room in her head for a man she barely knew, who said things she couldn't quite stop thinking about. What she knew was this. The next morning, she woke up before dawn and she worked. She worked until her hands blistered. She worked until her back ached. She worked until the sun went down, and then she came inside, and she ate whatever was easiest, and she went to bed, and she slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a person who had been useful. And she got up the next morning and did it again. Because Richard Caldwell had told an entire town that she wasn't capable of surviving on her own. And Emma Caldwell had decided with every quiet, furious, unshakable fiber of who she was to prove him a liar. The blisters on Emma's hands had barely healed before the town started talking again. She'd expected the whispers. She hadn't expected how organized they would become, the way the gossip moved through Harlow Creek, like water finding every crack, seeping into every conversation, coloring every interaction she had from the moment she set foot outside her property. At the market, women smiled at her with their mouths, while their eyes did something else entirely. At the post office, conversation slowed when she walked in and sped back up the moment she left. The blacksmith's wife, a woman Emma had shared Sunday dinners with for 6 years, crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Emma coming. Emma kept walking, kept her chin level, kept her hands busy. That was the only answer she had, and she was going to give it every single day until people got tired of waiting for her to collapse. She'd made progress on the homestead in the 3 weeks since Richard's announcement. Real, visible, measurable progress that no one could take away from her. The garden bed was turned and planted with a late-season crop of beans and squash that she'd bought with the last of her small personal savings. The fence along the south side was repaired post by post with reclaimed lumber she'd negotiated from the sawmill owner in exchange for 2 weeks of mending his family's laundry. The east window in the house had new glass fitted herself after Martha's husband had talked her through the process in painful, patient detail. Small things, but each one of them felt like a declaration. What she hadn't been able to fix was the barn roof. She'd known it was bad. She hadn't known how bad until the storm rolled through on the third Thursday of July, the kind of hard, fast Wyoming storm that came with no warning and left damage behind like it had something to prove. Emma had been inside when she heard the sound, a long, groaning crack from the direction of the barn, followed by something heavier, the percussion of old timber giving up. She went out in the rain and stood in the barn doorway and looked up at the sky through the hole where part of the roof used to be, and she felt for the first time since Richard left the specific and terrible weight of being entirely alone with a problem too large for one pair of hands. She didn't cry, but she stood there for a long moment, rain coming in sideways through the gap above her, soaking her shoulders, and she let herself feel the full size of it, the impossibility of it. And then, she made herself start thinking about how to solve it anyway. She was still thinking when she heard a horse outside. Luke Mercer came around the side of the barn on foot, already reading the damage with the calm, systematic eye of a man who had fixed more broken things than he could count. "I was riding back from the north pasture when the storm hit," he said. "Saw it from the road." He looked at the roof, the way the timber had split along the old nail line, the gap that was going to let rain into her hay storage if it wasn't addressed before the next storm. "You got any spare lumber on the property?" "Some," Emma said. She was still standing in the barn doorway, rain-damp and wrong-footed. "Not enough for the whole section." "No, but maybe enough for a temporary patch." He turned and looked at her directly. "I can help you assess what you need, if you want." The word "if" was doing something careful there, and Emma recognized it. He was giving her the option, not assuming, not walking in and taking over the way men in her experience generally did with the best of intentions, and no understanding of how it felt to have someone else's hands always on the wheel of your own life. "All right," she said. "Come and look." They spent the better part of an hour going through the barn together, Luke on his stomach across the upper beam, calling down measurements. Emma below, with a piece of charcoal and an old feed receipt she'd turned over to write on. He explained every assessment as he made it, not talking down, talking across the way one practical person talks to another practical person when there is a real problem to be solved. By the time they'd worked out what she had and what she needed, Emma knew 3 things. The patch job was possible, the permanent repair would cost more than she currently had, and Luke Mercer was not here because he felt sorry for her. He was here because he'd seen a problem and he had the skills to help address it. The distinction mattered enormously. "I can bring timber from Whitfield's supply shed," he said, climbing back down. "There's overage from a fencing project last month. I'll need to ask Carson, that's the ranch owner, but he won't mind. He's a practical man." "I don't want charity," Emma said immediately. Luke looked at her. "I was going to propose a trade." She waited. "I need someone to take over the bunkhouse cooking for the next 6 weeks. My regular cook broke 2 fingers on his right hand, and he can't manage the pots. I've got 11 men to feed 3 times a day and nobody who can do it. If you're willing to ride out to Whitfield's 3 days a week, cook the meals I can't manage, I'll bring the timber and spend 2 Saturdays on your roof." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "That's a fair trade." "I thought so. Why didn't you just say that at the start?" "Because you needed to hear about the timber first," he said simply. "If I'd led with the offer, it would have sounded like I was creating a problem in order to solve it. I wanted you to see the need was real before I mentioned what I could bring to the table." Emma stared at him. In 26 years of life, she could not remember a man stopping to think through how a proposal might land before making it, working out in advance how to present something so that it preserved her dignity rather than accidentally undermining it. "You think in complete paragraphs," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one held carefully in place. "My mother used to say I thought too much." "Your mother was wrong." He looked at her steadily for just a moment, and then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a post rail, and he turned to leave. "Monday morning," he said, "if that suits you." "Monday morning?" Emma confirmed. She watched him ride away for the second time in 2 weeks, and she noticed that the weight on her chest felt different than it had an hour ago. It was still there. The problem was still there. But it had edges now. Specific measurements. A plan. That was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. The gossip about Luke Mercer started within the week. Emma heard it first from Martha, who had heard it from the postmistress, who had gotten it from someone's husband, who drank at the same saloon where Richard Caldwell had apparently been holding court about the absurdity of the situation. The story as it was being told around town was that Luke Mercer had gotten himself tangled up with a bitter, discarded woman and was going to regret it. That a man of his reputation, honest, respected, a valued foreman at the county's most well-run ranch, had no business spending his time out at that run-down Caldwell property, and that whatever Emma was doing to secure his attention, it reflected poorly on both of them. Emma listened to Martha relay this and then said, "Who is spreading that version specifically?" Martha hesitated. "Martha?" "Richard, and a few of his friends from the business circle." Martha looked uncomfortable. "And 1 or 2 of the women who I think are well. Some people are frightened of a woman who doesn't fall apart when she's supposed to. It makes them nervous." Emma thought about that for a moment. "Let them be nervous," she said. "You're not angry." "I am absolutely furious," Emma said pleasantly. "But being furious doesn't change anything. Working does." She went out to the garden and she worked. Luke came on Monday morning as promised, with timber loaded in the ranch wagon and 2 of his younger ranch hands along to help with the heavy lifting. He introduced them brothers Hector and James Brill, both quiet and efficient in the way of men who've been taught to work without making a production of it. He gave them their tasks immediately and without theater, and they set about the work without complaint. Emma had coffee ready and biscuits because she had been raised to feed people who were working on her property, and she was not going to stop now. She set it out on the porch rail and told them to take it when they needed it. Hector, the older brother, looked at the biscuits and then at Emma like she'd handed him something from a different, better world. "Ma'am," he said, "I have not had a biscuit worth eating since my grandmother passed, and these smell like her kitchen." "Then eat them before they get cold," Emma told him. Luke, passing behind her with a length of timber on his shoulder, caught her eye. That almost smile again, small and entirely genuine. By noon, the temporary patch was on. By early afternoon, Luke had assessed the permanent repair and written out the materials list in the same careful, methodical way he did everything measured, deliberate, complete. He went over it with Emma at the kitchen table, while Hector and James ate their lunch on the porch, talking quietly between themselves. "This is what you'll need when you're ready for the full repair," Luke said, sliding the list across to her. "I can get most of it at cost through the ranch supplier if you buy in the fall prices drop after the main building season ends. That gives you time to save for it." Emma studied the list. She had some of what she needed already in the form of a small sum she'd been setting aside from the preserves she'd started selling through the general store jars of tomato, green bean, pickled cucumber. Things she'd been putting up for years for her own household, and had suddenly realized represented value she could trade. Not much money, but building. "I can get there by October," she said. "Then we'll plan for October." Luke gathered the list and handed it back to her. He glanced up. "The preserves, I saw them in Hanson's store yesterday. The whole shelf was nearly empty. Mrs. Hanson reordered twice last week," Emma said. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone because she didn't want to seem like she was gloating. But the preserves were moving. People in Harlow Creek had apparently discovered that Emma Caldwell could put up a jar of tomatoes that tasted like the last good day of summer, and they were buying it. "You're underpricing them," Luke said. She blinked. "I'm pricing them at what people expect to pay. You're pricing them at what you think people will accept from a woman they've been told has nothing." He said it without cruelty, like something he'd simply noticed and thought she should know. "They'd pay more. The quality is there. You're just not charging for it." Emma sat back in her chair. He was right. She hated how straightforwardly right he was. "What would you charge?" she asked. 3 cents more per large jar, 2 more per small. It's still fair. It's just accurate." She looked at him for a moment. "You've given this some thought." "I walked past the display for the 3rd time this week," he said. "It occurred to me." 3 times in 1 week. Emma filed that away somewhere and didn't examine it. Not yet. "I'll talk to Hanson," she said. "Good." Luke pushed back from the table and reached for his hat. Outside, she could hear Hector and James beginning to pack up. "Wednesday for the ranch cooking." "Wednesday," Emma confirmed. "What time?" "Early. My men start before dawn. Breakfast is the most important meal." "Before dawn it is." He nodded and went out. Emma stayed at the table with the materials list in front of her, and she thought about 3 cents more per jar, and what that added up to over the course of a month, and what that month added up to over the course of a year, and somewhere in the middle of that arithmetic, she felt something opening inside her chest. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But the shape of it. The outline. The suggestion that happiness was possible. Wednesday mornings at Whitfield Ranch became the fixed point of Emma's week. She rode out before sunup, negotiated the dark with the steady confidence of a woman who had always been an early riser and had simply added more purpose to it. The Whitfield bunkhouse kitchen was large and well-stocked, the kind of setup that existed to feed working men and made no claims toward elegance, which suited Emma perfectly. She cooked without fuss, biscuits, salt pork eggs, when the supply allowed strong coffee, and every 3rd week a Dutch oven full of something that made the whole bunkhouse go quiet in the particular way that indicated genuine appreciation. The ranch hands treated her with careful, instinctive respect. Not because Luke had told them to, she never saw him tell them anything about it specifically, but because he modeled it himself, and men who work for a good foreman tend to take their cues from him. He said please and thank you. He asked rather than told. He treated her cooking as something of value rather than a service to be taken for granted. The first morning she had come to do the cooking. One of the older hands, a weathered man named Clyde, who had the air of someone who had seen most things twice and was seldom surprised by any of them, had watched her work for a while and then said without particular ceremony, "You're the one who's fixing up the Caldwell homestead." "My homestead," Emma had said without looking up from the biscuit dough. "It's mine now." "Heard about what happened," Clyde said. "Most people have. I knew Richard Caldwell some years back, bought a horse off him." He paused. "Horse was lame inside a month. Didn't show it at the sale." Emma looked up at him. Clyde shrugged the gesture of a man delivering a verdict he'd reached long ago. "Some people you don't see what they are until you've paid for it." Emma said nothing, but she thought about that for a long time. The town's opinion of Emma Caldwell began to shift sometime around the 6th week, though it was more tide-turn than single event, gradual and total, and hard to point to a specific moment. Part of it was the homestead itself. People who rode past the edge of Harlow Creek started noticing that the neglected wreck of a property was beginning to look different. The fence line was straight now. The garden was visibly producing. There were chickens. Emma had purchased 6 from a neighbor who was downsizing, and she had gone from knowing almost nothing about chickens to understanding them with the focused competence she brought to everything she decided to understand. She sold eggs. She sold preserves. She sold 3 dozen baked rolls to the hotel on the South Road when their usual supplier came up short, and the hotel owner came back the following week and asked to make it a standing arrangement. The money she was making was small, but it was real and it was hers, and every dollar of it went straight back into the homestead. And part of the shift was simply the sight of Emma herself showing up at the market on Saturday mornings with something to sell rather than something to beg, carrying herself with a quiet self-possession that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the story that she was a woman who had been rightly discarded. She didn't perform confidence. She didn't need to. She had something better, actual evidence. Martha told her one afternoon in early September, with considerable satisfaction, that she had overheard two women outside the fabric shop revising their opinion of Emma out loud to each other in terms that suggested they'd been doing it privately for some time. One of them said, and I am quoting directly, Martha said that she thought it was remarkable what Emma Caldwell had done with that property. Remarkable. That's a better word than stubborn, Emma said. Richard used to use both. I know. Martha looked at her for a moment. How are things going with Luke Mercer? Emma had been expecting this. She had been, in fact, half waiting for it. We have a working arrangement, she said carefully. Martha said. A working arrangement that has him stopping by your property at least twice a week. He's been helping with the barn repair. He finished the barn repair 3 weeks ago. Emma set down what she was doing and looked at Martha. I'm just observing, Martha said entirely without apology. He comes by to check on the well, Emma said. The water level has been inconsistent and he has more experience with... Emma. What? He comes by because he wants to see you. Martha said it simply the way she said everything simple, with the directness of a woman who had no patience for unnecessary detours. And you light up when he does, even though you're doing your absolute level best not to. Emma opened her mouth, closed it again. That's not what this is, she said. All right, said Martha, in the tone of someone agreeing to let a perfectly obvious thing be denied for a little while longer. Oh, the well conversation happened in early October. Luke had come by on a Tuesday, not a Wednesday, not a Saturday, a Tuesday, which neither of them commented on directly, and they'd been standing at the edge of the well discussing the water table and whether it was worth boring deeper before winter or waiting to see how the spring rains ran. It was a practical conversation. They had a great many practical conversations. But there was something underneath this one that had been building for weeks the way pressure builds under something solid, patient and invisible and impossible to ignore once you became aware of it. You should bore before winter, Luke said. He was crouched at the edge, checking the rope depth. If it drops any further in the cold months, you won't have enough for the livestock. I know, Emma said. I've been pricing it. Burroughs does good work. I can put you in touch. I've already spoken to him, actually. She paused. I've spoken to a lot of people. I'm getting better at asking for what I need. Luke looked up at her. You were never bad at it. I was terrible at it, Emma said. I spent 8 years asking for things indirectly and hoping Richard would understand what I meant, hoping he'd see what I needed without my having to say it. She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. It's a terrible way to live. It is, Luke said quietly. I don't do it anymore. He held her gaze, and then he said, I noticed. The silence between them had a different quality than it usually did. Emma felt the weight of everything she hadn't said, and he hadn't said, and both of them had been carefully navigating around for the better part of 2 months. Luke, she said. Emma. I'm not ready, she said. Whatever this is, whatever it's becoming. I need more time. He nodded once. No argument, no performance of understanding, just actual understanding, immediate and uncomplicated. All right, that doesn't... She stopped. Started again. That's not me telling you to go away. I know, he said. I'm telling you I need to know who I am on my own first, before I figure out who I am with anyone else. That's the most sensible thing I've heard in a long time, he said. He stood up from the well and brushed the dust off his knees and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze of his. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't see what I see when I look at you. And what do you see? She asked before she could stop herself. He thought about it. Not performing the pause, actually considering. Someone who was told she wasn't capable, he said finally, and who is in the process of proving completely and methodically that every person who said that was wrong. He picked up his hat. It's a remarkable thing to watch. He left her standing by the well, with her heart doing something entirely unreasonable, and her head reminding her firmly that she had a bore well to commission and a winter to prepare for, and a homestead to run. Both of those things were true. And the remarkable thing Emma thought was that for the first time in her life, they didn't feel like they were in competition with each other. Richard Caldwell came by the general store on the third Saturday of October while Emma was making her weekly delivery. She was carrying 2 crates of preserves through Hanson's back door when she heard his voice in the front of the store, that familiar cadence, the easy confidence of a man who'd never had reason to second-guess his welcome. He was talking to Hanson about some business matter, and he hadn't seen her yet. Emma kept walking. She set down her crates. She straightened up. She walked into the front of the store to hand Hanson the invoice for the week. Richard saw her and went completely still. She looked at him. He looked at her. She thought she saw something move across his face. Something she couldn't quite read from this distance. From this place she was standing now, which was so far from where she'd stood the last time she'd seen him, that she barely recognized the old position. "Emma," he said. "Richard," she said evenly. She handed Hanson the invoice. She exchanged the few words of business that needed exchanging. She picked up her empty crates, and she turned and walked back out through Hanson's front door without hurrying and without looking back. Out on the street, she stood for a moment in the cool October air. She waited for the feeling she expected, the tightness, the anger, the residual grief of 8 years, compressed into 30 seconds of eye contact. What she felt instead was almost nothing. Not numbness, not suppression, just distance. Real earned distance, the kind you don't manufacture, but simply accumulate by spending enough weeks doing something that matters more than the hurt. She walked home. She had a bore well to organize. She had preserves to put up. She had an order of rolls due at the hotel by Friday morning, and somewhere on the other side of all that work, patient and steady and remarkably uncomplicated, was Luke Mercer. That thought as she walked sat somewhere in her chest, like the first small warmth of a fire just beginning to take hold. She let it. The first snow of the season came early that year. Emma was in the middle of renegotiating her egg supply contract with the hotel when the temperature dropped overnight and the whole county woke up to white. She didn't stop working. She pulled on an extra layer, wrapped her hands against the cold, and went out to check on the chickens before she did anything else, because the chickens were a business now, and businesses didn't pause for weather. That was the woman she had become. By November of 1887, methodical, forward-thinking, completely disinclined to be surprised by difficulty. 16 months after Richard Caldwell had announced his departure from her life on a public street, Emma's homestead was producing. Not in the spectacular, dramatic way of stories told to impress people, but in the deep, unglamorous, compounding way of real work. The garden had put up enough to carry her through the winter with surplus left for sale. The egg business was steady. The hotel rolls had become a twice-weekly order that the manager had stopped calling optional and started calling essential. And the preserves, 3 cents more per jar, as Luke had suggested, were outselling every comparable product on Hanson's shelves. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable in any lavish sense of the word. But she was solvent, and she was independent, and she had built every inch of it with her own hands and her own judgment. Which was why, when she came in from the chicken coop that cold November morning, and found Martha Givens sitting at her kitchen table with the particular expression of a woman carrying news she doesn't entirely know what to do with, Emma felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "What happened?" Emma said. Not a question. Martha looked at her. "Richard is back." The kitchen went very quiet. Emma set down the egg basket. She unwrapped her hands. She went to the stove and poured herself coffee, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing not to react before they had all the information. "Back as in passing through," she said, "or back as in staying?" "Staying," Martha said. "He arrived 3 days ago. He's at the Harlow Creek Hotel." She paused. "Alone." Emma turned around. Where's Victoria Hale? That, said Martha, is the question everyone is asking. She folded her hands on the table. What I've been able to piece together, and it's early, so some of this could still change, is that the railroad investment Gerald Hale staked everything on failed. Badly. Something went wrong with the land surveys or the financing or both. People are saying Hale lost close to everything. And if Hale lost everything, then Richard's new life lost everything with it, Emma said. Yes. Emma sat down. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. She was running through it, the timeline, the logic, the arithmetic of a man who had traded loyalty for opportunity and was now sitting in a hotel 2 miles from where she was sitting, stripped of the opportunity and presumably reconsidering the loyalty. Has he tried to contact me? Not yet, Martha said. But Emma. She leaned forward slightly. You need to understand something. The homestead, the land it sits on. What about it? Martha pressed her lips together. There's been talk. Since August, when the railroad announced the new northern route. The line is coming through Harlow County, and the right-of-way corridor runs very close to the eastern edge of Harlow Creek. She watched Emma's face. Close to your property. Emma set her cup down slowly. The land adjacent to a rail corridor becomes worth significantly more, Emma said. Yes. And Richard would know that. He always paid attention to railroad news, Martha said. It's how he got mixed up with the Hales in the first place. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Emma could feel the shape of what was coming, assembling itself in her mind, the full, inevitable architecture of it, every piece clicking into place with the cold, mechanical precision of a trap being set. Richard hadn't just come back because his money was gone. Richard had come back because her land was suddenly worth something he hadn't expected, and he had done the calculation, and the calculation had brought him 2 miles down the road to the Harlow Creek Hotel. He thinks he can come back, Emma said. I believe so. He thinks I'll take him back. Martha looked at her carefully. He's been telling people that you were always the love of his life, that he made a terrible mistake, that he's hoping to rebuild what he threw away. She paused. He said it to at least 4 people at the hotel bar the first night he arrived. I'm told it was quite moving. Emma looked at her oldest friend across the table. He's performing it, Emma said. Yes, Martha said. I believe he is. Emma stood up. She went to the window. She stood there with her back to the room, and she thought about 16 months of work. 16 months of blisters and cold mornings and calculations scratched on the backs of feed receipts and every small dignity she had built back up one careful piece at a time. He's not getting this land, she said. Her voice was very quiet. That was how Emma Caldwell sounded when she was completely serious, not loud, not theatrical, just absolutely still. No, Martha agreed. He's not. Richard came to the homestead on a Thursday afternoon 4 days after his return. Emma had known he would. She'd spent those 4 days preparing not emotionally, because that preparation had been happening for 16 months, but practically. She had spoken to the county recorder's office about the status of the property deed. She had spoken with deliberate casualness to the land surveyor who boarded at the Whitfield Ranch. She had spoken to Hanson at the general store, who had connections to the new rail surveying team, and who had confirmed quietly that yes, the eastern corridor was likely running within a half-mile of her property line, possibly closer. She knew what she had. She knew what it was worth. She was not going to be caught off guard by a man who thought she was still the woman who hadn't known the nail needed to go in at an angle. She was in the yard when he came up the road. She didn't go inside. She stood where she was and waited. Richard Caldwell looked like a man who had been through something. Not devastated, he was too vain for that, would never let himself be seen as devastated, but worn in the particular way of someone who had been running a performance for months and was starting to feel the cost of it. He was still dressed well, still carried himself with that easy, practiced confidence, but there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Emma, he said. Richard, she said. He looked around the yard. She watched him do it, watched his eyes move over the straight fence line, The full chicken yard, the repaired barn, the kitchen garden now mulched down for winter, the new glass in the east window that caught the afternoon light. She watched him calculating. She let him calculate. "You've done remarkable things with this place," he said. "Thank you." "I mean it." He looked back at her. "I had no idea." "You had every idea," Emma said pleasantly. "You thought it was worthless. You gave it to me because you thought I wouldn't be able to do anything with it, and it would embarrass me. That was its purpose." He opened his mouth, closed it, had the grace at least to not try to deny it. "I heard you were back," Emma continued. "I heard about Gerald Hale's investment. I'm sorry it didn't work out the way you planned." "Emma, I'm not finished." She kept her voice level. It wasn't difficult. She had been waiting for this conversation for months in some quiet part of her mind, and now that it was here, she found she didn't need to raise her voice at all. "I know why you're here, Richard, and I want to be very clear about something before you say whatever you came to say." He was very still. "This homestead is mine," Emma said. "The deed is in my name. Every improvement on this property was made by my labor, my planning, and my resources. Not yours. Not anyone else's. Mine." She looked at him without blinking. "And it will stay mine." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. There it was, the thing under the performance, the real Richard, the one who didn't get what he expected and showed it. "I didn't come here to take your property," he said. "No, I came because I made a mistake. The worst mistake of my life." He shifted his weight. She recognized that too, the shift, the recalibration, the pivot from one approach to another when the first one wasn't working. "I should never have left. You were a good wife, Emma. Better than I deserved." "Yes," Emma said. "I was." He blinked. He had expected either tears or coldness, she could see that. He hadn't expected agreement delivered in quite this tone, the calm, factual tone of a woman stating something she has known for a long time. Then, "But that's not a reason to come back," she said. "The fact that I was good to you is not an argument for returning to someone who wasn't good to me. I can be different, Richard." She said his name with a finality that stopped him mid-sentence. "You didn't leave me because I wasn't good enough. You left me because you saw something that looked more valuable, and you took it. And now that it's gone, you've come back to look for the next valuable thing." She held his gaze. "I know about the rail corridor." The color shifted slightly in his face. Just slightly, but Emma saw it. "I don't know what you—" "Yes, you do," she said quietly. He went silent. The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the chicken yard, one of the hens made a small, irritable sound. Ordinary life continuing completely indifferent to the wreckage of a marriage being sorted through in the yard. "You should go back to town," Emma said. "And I think you should consider moving on from Harlow County. There's nothing here for you anymore. Emma?" His voice had changed. The performance was dropping, and what was underneath it was something rawer. Not love, she didn't think, or not primarily, but genuine desperation. The desperation of a man who had gambled everything and lost and was running out of moves. "I have nowhere." "That's not my problem," she said. And she meant it. She felt how completely she meant it all the way down, the way you feel something true, when it has stopped being painful and become simply factual. "You built a life for 8 years on my labor and my loyalty," she said. "You walked away from it when you thought you'd found something better. Whatever comes next for you is a consequence of that decision, not something I'm responsible for fixing." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face, she thought, if she was being generous, that it might have been the first genuine thing she'd seen from him all afternoon. "I don't recognize you," he said. Not unkindly, with something that was almost close to wonder. "I know," Emma said. "That's because you never really looked." He left. She stood in the yard and watched him ride back toward town, and she waited for the feeling she'd been half afraid of, the old pull, the residual gravity of 8 years of her life attached to the back of that departing figure. She waited for it. It didn't come. What came instead was Luke Mercer riding in from the North Road exactly 12 minutes later, which meant he'd been watching from a distance and had timed his approach for after Richard was gone. "I saw him leave," Luke said, climbing down. He looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Emma said. "And then, how long were you watching?" "Long enough to make sure you didn't need me to step in." He held her gaze. "Did you?" "No, I didn't think so." He was watching her face with that particular attention of his, reading something she'd come to understand that was more than just her expression. Reading the whole of her. "What did he say?" Emma told him. All of it cleanly and without editorializing the same way she would have told Martha. She'd gotten to know that Luke was the kind of man you could tell things straight without softening and without performance, because he could handle the full weight of a thing without needing to either minimize it or make it bigger than it was. When she finished, Luke was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try again," he said. "I know. He's not going to just accept that answer. I know that too." Emma looked toward the road where Richard had disappeared. "He's going to go back to town and tell people a new story. Probably that I've become bitter and unreasonable. Probably that outside influence has changed me." Luke's jaw tightened slightly. "Outside influence." "You," Emma said plainly. "He's going to find out about you and me. There is nothing between you and me that requires explanation or defense," Luke said. His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it she didn't hear from him often. Something with edges. "He gave up the right to have opinions about your life when he walked out of it. He doesn't see it that way. Then he'll need to be corrected." Emma looked at him. "Luke, I can handle Richard Caldwell. I know you can." He met her eyes. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore. If you don't want to." The sentence landed between them with a weight she hadn't expected. She stood inside it for a moment, this man who had shown up with timber and measurements, and the radical and revolutionary notion that a woman running her own homestead was something to admire rather than manage, and she thought about Richard's face when he'd said he didn't recognize her. She thought about how that was the best thing he'd ever said to her, even if he hadn't meant it that way. "He's going to make a scene," she said finally. "In public. That's what he does when he doesn't get what he wants." "Let him," Luke said quietly. "People will listen. Some will." He shrugged a small direct movement. "Some people have been watching what you've built here for a year. They've been watching you show up every week, do what you said you'd do, deliver what you said you'd deliver. Those people aren't going to be moved by a speech from a man who left." He looked at her steadily. "You've already made your argument, Emma. You made it every single day for 16 months. He can't talk over that." Emma stood very still. She thought about 16 months of work laid end to end. Every morning she'd gotten up before dawn. Every evening she'd fallen into bed with her hands aching and her mind still running the next day's list. Every small, unglamorous, completely unwitnessed decision she'd made about a fence post or a bread order or a pricing conversation with the man at the general store. All of it still here. All of it still standing. Richard could say whatever he wanted. The fence was straight. The jars were on the shelf. The deed was in her name. "You're right," she said. Luke nodded as though this had never been particularly in question. He picked up his hat, which he'd been turning in his hands while they talked, and settled it on his head. "I'll be here Saturday to look at the south fence post," he said. "The frost will have shifted the base. We should reset it before the ground freezes solid." "I'll have coffee on," Emma said. He looked at her. That almost smile, the one she'd stopped trying to ignore some weeks back, moved at the corner of his mouth. "Good night, Emma." "Good night, Luke." She stood in the yard as he rode back toward the North Road. And the cold was sharper now, the kind of November cold that meant serious winter coming. And somewhere behind her in the kitchen, the fire needed building up, and tomorrow morning, the chickens needed feeding before anything else. And Friday was the hotel roll order. And Saturday, Luke was coming to reset the fence post. Her life was full. Terribly, wonderfully, completely full. And Richard Caldwell, riding back toward town with his empty plans and his new story for the first time, Emma realized he felt exactly as far away as he was. She went inside and built up the fire. Richard Caldwell did not leave Harlow County. Emma had expected him to. She'd told him there was nothing here for him, and she'd meant it, and she'd assumed, based on 16 months of watching his absence from her life, that he operated on the same clean logic she did. That he would assess the situation, recognize the position he was in, and move on to wherever the next opportunity presented itself. She had underestimated again how much Richard Caldwell needed an audience. He stayed at the hotel. He made himself visible. He had long conversations in the saloon with men he'd done business with before his departure. Conversations that Emma heard about in fragments through Martha, through Clyde's occasional reports from the Whitfield bunkhouse, through the general osmosis of small-town information that moved through Harlow Creek, whether anyone wanted it to or not. He was working a story. She could feel the shape of it being constructed piece by piece, conversation by conversation. The careful architecture of a man trying to rebuild his reputation on borrowed ground. The story, as near as Emma could piece it together, went something like this. Richard had made a mistake. He was man enough to admit it. He had been dazzled by the Hale money and had walked away from the woman who truly loved him and the marriage that had been in its core a good one. He had paid for that mistake, paid for it thoroughly, lost everything, learned his lesson in the most painful way possible. And now he was back humbled and honest, wanting only to make things right. It was an excellent story. Emma had to acknowledge that. It had the right texture, the admission of fault, the redemptive arc, the satisfying shape of a man brought low and made wiser by his fall. People liked that story. People wanted to believe it because it meant the world worked the way they hoped it worked, where men faced consequences and changed and came back better. What it left out, of course, was the rail corridor. What it left out was the deed in Emma's name that sat between Richard and the most valuable piece of land in Harlow County. Emma knew this. Luke knew this. Martha knew this. But knowing a thing and being able to prove it publicly were two different problems, and Richard was smart enough to never say the quiet part out loud. The harvest celebration was the last Saturday of November. Harlow Creek had held the harvest celebration every year since the town was incorporated, a community event at the Grange Hall dancing food. The announcement of the county's agricultural prizes and the general collective exhale of a community that had made it through another growing season. Emma had attended every year of her marriage as Richard's wife. This was the second year she would attend as herself. She almost didn't go, not because she was afraid of seeing Richard. She was past afraid of Richard. But she knew with the instinct of someone who had learned to read the mechanics of public situations that the harvest celebration was the kind of stage Richard would not be able to resist. The whole town in one room. His story already circulating. The natural drama of the estranged husband and wife in the same space for the first time since his return. He was going to do something. She could feel it coming the same way she'd felt the July storm coming, that shift in the air before the crack. "You should go," Martha said on the Thursday before. "If you don't, people will say you're hiding." "I know. And if you go, you'll be walking into whatever he's planning." "I know that too." "So," Emma looked at her. "So I'm going." Martha exhaled. "Good. I'll walk in with you." "You don't have to." "I want to," Martha said flatly. "I have wanted to watch you walk into a room and make Richard Caldwell regret every life choice he's made since July of 1886 for a very long time. I am not missing this." Despite everything, Emma almost smiled. So, Luke came to the homestead on Friday morning with the quiet efficiency she'd come to associate with him, handling things he thought were important, without making a production of handling them. He'd finished resetting the south fence posts the previous Saturday and had been back twice during the week for reasons that had become somewhat thin as pretexts. Once to check that the posts had settled correctly. Once to drop off a length of rope he'd said she might need, but which she rather suspected she wouldn't. She had not commented on either visit. She had made coffee both times and let the pretexts stand. Now he stood in her kitchen and said, "I'll be at the harvest celebration tomorrow night." Emma looked up from the bread she was making. "All right. I wanted you to know. I figured you'd be there. You're Whitfield's foreman." He'll want the ranch represented. Yes. He paused. But I also wanted to be there because you'll be there. And I have a feeling Richard is going to try something, and I want you to know you won't be standing alone in that room. Emma set down what she was doing and looked at him directly. Luke, I can handle it yourself, he finished. I know. I am not suggesting otherwise. He held her gaze. I'm telling you that you have someone in your corner. That's different from stepping in front of you. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the ways men had tried to help her over the course of her life. Richard's help, which had always had conditions attached. Her father's help, which had always come with the assumption that he knew better. Even the well-meaning help of neighbors that had carried underneath it the unspoken suggestion that she was someone in need of managing. Luke's help had never once felt like that. Not the timber, not the fence, not the well, not the pricing conversation at the kitchen table. Every single time it had felt like something offered freely and without fine print from a man who genuinely believed she was capable of doing the work herself and simply wanted to make the work easier. Thank you, she said, for telling me. He nodded. I'll see you there. The Grange Hall was full by the time Emma and Martha arrived. The harvest celebration always drew the whole county families from the outlying ranches, the business owners and their wives, the hotel guests who happened to be in town, the older residents who came for the music and stayed for the gossip. Lanterns everywhere, the smell of food and good wood smoke, and the particular social electricity of a crowd that had been working hard all season and was ready for one night of something easier. Emma walked in with her chin level and Martha at her shoulder, and she felt the room adjust around her. Subtle collective the way a crowd responds to the arrival of a person they've been anticipating. She spotted Richard immediately. He was near the far end of the room with a group of men she recognized, local businessmen, the hotel owner, 2 ranchers from the north end of the county. He saw her at almost the same moment. She watched him make the calculation, the slight straightening, the deliberate settling of his expression into something careful and prepared. He was ready. He'd been ready for this. Emma turned her back on him and greeted the Whitfield ranch family who were standing nearby. Carson Whitfield, a square-built, white-haired man who had run his ranch for 30 years and who greeted Emma with the direct warmth he extended to people he considered serious. Beside him, Luke stood with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with where he was, and when his eyes met Emma's across the greeting, something in her chest steadied. She moved through the room. She talked to people she knew. The hotel manager about the roll order for December, the seamstress, about a piece of work she'd been putting off the schoolteacher's wife, who had recently become one of Emma's most consistent preserve customers. She was present and ordinary, and entirely unafraid, and she could feel in the way you feel a current in a room that people were watching her and revising something. The music started. People danced. The food came out. The county agricultural prizes were announced. Emma received honorable mention for her preserves, which caused a small, genuine burst of applause from the section of the room that had been buying them all season, and which caused Richard, she noticed from the corner of her eye, to go very still. He made his move an hour into the evening. She had been half expecting it for the entire evening. What she hadn't predicted was the method. He didn't come to her privately. He went to the center of the room during a pause in the music, and he spoke loudly enough for the people nearest to him to stop talking and look, and then for the people beyond them to stop and look until the whole room was paying attention. "I'd like to say something," Richard said, "if people will indulge me." The room went quiet, with the particular quality of a crowd that has just been handed exactly what it was waiting for. "I've been back in Harlow Creek for 2 weeks," he said, "and I know there are a lot of stories going around about why I'm here and what I want. I'd rather speak plainly than let stories do the talking." He looked around the room with the practiced sincerity of a man who had been rehearsing this. "I made the worst mistake of my life when I left this town. When I left my wife." He paused. "Emma, I know you're here tonight, and I'd like to ask in front of everyone who knows us for the chance to make it right, to come back, to rebuild what we had." Every head in the room turned toward Emma. She felt the weight of it. 300 people holding their breath, the full collective attention of her community bearing down on her like a physical thing. She felt it, and she let it settle, and she took exactly the time she needed, and then she walked to the center of the room. She stopped a few feet from Richard. She looked at him. Really looked at him, with the unhurried clarity of a woman who had spent 16 months learning to see accurately, and then she turned slightly, so that she was addressing both him and the room. "Richard," she said. Her voice carried without effort. "I've listened to what you said, and I want to respond honestly because that's what this community deserves." She paused. Not for effect, because she was choosing her words with the same care she gave everything now. "You didn't leave me because our marriage had failed," she said. "You left me because you believed something more valuable was waiting for you somewhere else. That's a different thing." She held his gaze. "And you've come back for the same reason. Not because you love me, because you ran the numbers." A ripple moved through the crowd. She heard it, the collective intake, the shift. Richard's jaw tightened. "Emma, that's not—" "The rail corridor," she said calmly, "runs within half a mile of my eastern property line. The land you gave me, because you thought it was worthless, is now among the most valuable parcels in this county." She looked at him steadily. "Did you know that when you came back—" The room was absolutely silent. Richard said nothing. "I'm not asking to humiliate you," Emma continued. "I'm asking because it matters. Because the answer tells everyone in this room, including me, what kind of conversation we're actually having." She waited. "Did you know about the rail corridor, Richard? Before you came back?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. She watched it go, watched the performance layer peel back, watched the real thing underneath it, try to decide what to do. "Emma." "Yes or no," she said quietly. The silence stretched. And then Richard Caldwell, for the first time in her direct experience of him, did something she had not predicted. He looked away. That was the answer. The whole room understood it at the same time. Emma did not a spoken confession, but a silence so total and so complete that it said everything a spoken confession would have said and more. Martha, standing at the edge of the crowd, made a sound that was not quite a word. Emma heard it. She heard other things too, murmurs, the shifting of people's weight, the specific kind of collective noise a crowd makes when a story they've been told is being replaced in real time with the true version. She took a breath. She kept her voice level. "I spent 8 years in this marriage," she said. 8 years giving everything I had to a household, a relationship, a life I believed in. And when you left, people in this town said I wasn't capable of surviving on my own. That I'd sell the homestead within a month. That I had nothing without you." She paused. "I'd like to address that too." She turned just slightly, just enough to acknowledge the whole room, rather than just Richard. "Every fence post on my property I set myself, or negotiated the help to set. Every jar of preserves on Hanson's shelf I put up myself. Every roll at the hotel, every egg contract, every improvement to that homestead that was built by my hands, my planning, and my judgment." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Not because anyone helped me become capable, because I already was. I just finally had the space to prove it." The room was so quiet she could hear the fire in the corner stove. "So no, Richard," she said, turning back to him. "I won't be coming back to you. Not because I'm bitter. Not because I'm punishing you, because I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly what this offer is, and I have far too much respect for myself to accept it." She looked at him with something that was not anger, not triumph, but something quieter and more complete. "I hope you find what you're looking for somewhere else. I genuinely do. But it isn't here." Richard stood in the center of the room. He looked for just a moment, like a man who had arrived expecting a door to be open, and found a wall instead. Not a wall thrown up in haste, but one that had been built brick by brick over a very long time. Solid all the way through. He picked up his hat from the table beside him. He walked out of the Grange Hall without another word. The door closed behind him. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved, And then Carson Whitfield started clapping, a slow, deliberate, completely unsentimental applause that had nothing theatrical about it, just a man expressing a clear opinion. A few others joined, then more. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't dramatic. It was the specific sound of a community recalibrating, deciding where it stood, and landing somewhere different from where it had started. Emma stood in the center of the room and felt it wash over her. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something she could only describe later to Martha as rightness. The specific feeling of having said the true thing at the true moment in front of the true people. Martha appeared at her elbow within seconds, her eyes bright. "You," she said, "are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." "I just told the truth," Emma said. "Yes," Martha said. "That's what I mean." Luke was there a moment later, not rushing, not making theater of it, just appearing at her side with the same quiet consistency that had characterized every moment of the past 16 months. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood beside her close enough that she could feel his presence like the bank of a river, steady and certain. "Are you all right?" he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "Yes," Emma said. And then, because it was true, and she was done with saying less than the true thing, better than all right. He looked at her. That almost smile, the one she'd stopped trying to resist weeks ago, moved at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. The music started again. People began to move back into conversation, into dancing, into the ordinary warm motion of an evening that had now tilted on its axis and settled into something new. Emma stood at the edge of it for a moment and looked around at the room, the faces she'd known for years. Some of them recalibrated. Some of them exactly where they'd always been, all of them part of the life she was building, and she thought, "This is mine, all of it. Every conversation, every contract, every jar on the shelf, every fence post set at the right angle. Hers." Luke was still beside her. She looked at him. "Dance with me," she said. He looked faintly surprised. Not much. He wasn't a man who showed much, but enough that she saw it and was glad she'd said it first. "I should warn you," he said. "I'm not a particularly elegant dancer." "Neither am I," Emma said. "But I'd like to try." He offered his hand. She took it. And across the Grange Hall of Harlow Creek, on the last Saturday of November 1887, Emma Caldwell danced. Not as someone's discarded wife, not as a cautionary tale, not as a woman who had narrowly survived something, but as exactly who she was, a landowner, a businesswoman, a neighbor, a friend, and a woman who had, against considerable odds and with no help from the man who had underestimated her, built something real. Richard Caldwell's reputation in Harlow County did not recover from that evening. The story that had been in the process of being carefully constructed, the reformed husband, the humble return the love story with a second chance, collapsed the moment he failed to answer Emma's question. People remembered that silence. People in small towns always remember the silences. Within a week, the version circulating in the saloon and the fabric shop and the post office was the accurate one. He had come back for the land. He had been found out by the woman he'd left. He had walked out without a word. He left Harlow County before December. Nobody was particularly surprised, and nobody, as far as Emma ever heard, was particularly sorry to see him go. Richard Caldwell left Harlow County on a Tuesday morning in early December, and the town barely paused to mark it. That was the thing Emma hadn't anticipated, not the leaving itself, but how little space it took up when it finally happened. No drama, no farewell. The hotel owner mentioned to Martha that Richard had settled his bill and asked about the stage schedule to Cheyenne, and by noon he was gone, and by evening most people had moved on to talking about the early frost and whether the North Pass would close before Christmas. Emma found out from Martha the same way she'd found out most things about Richard over the past 16 months. She was in the middle of filling a hotel order when Martha came in with the news, and she set down what she was doing, and she sat with the information for a moment. This man who had occupied so much of her interior life, this enormous presence that had shaped 8 years of who she was, and 2 years of who she was becoming, simply gone in a Tuesday morning transaction involving a stage ticket and a settled bill. "How do you feel?" Martha asked. Emma thought about it honestly. "Like a window just opened in a room that's been closed for a very long time," she said. Martha looked at her. "That's a good answer?" "It's the true one." She went back to the hotel order. She had 12 dozen rolls due by Friday, and a new contract to finalize with the county courthouse, which had recently expressed interest in her catering services for a series of town meetings scheduled through the spring. She had things to do. She had always had things to do, but now the things felt different, lighter somehow, as though they'd been carrying a weight she hadn't consciously identified, and the weight had simply lifted. She finished the order. She wrote the courthouse proposal that evening by lamplight, careful and specific, the same way she did everything now. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept without difficulty. She woke up the next morning and thought, "This is what free feels like." The winter of 1887 into 1888 was the quietest stretch Emma could remember in the best possible sense. The homestead settled into its rhythms. The morning chicken run, the bread baking, the order fulfillment, the accounting she did every Sunday evening at the kitchen table, tracking every dollar in and out with a precision that would have astonished the woman she'd been 3 years ago. The woman who had let Richard handle the money because she hadn't thought of financial management as something that belonged to her. She had since discovered that she was, in fact, considerably better at it than Richard had ever been. Luke came by twice a week, sometimes 3 times, when there was work that warranted it, and the pretexts had gotten thinner, and then had given up being pretexts entirely. He simply came. He came on Saturdays to work alongside her on whatever the property needed that week, and he came on Wednesday evenings and sat at her kitchen table with coffee and talked. Really talked, the way Emma had not talked to anyone in years, about things that mattered and things that didn't, about the county, and the weather, and the business of ranching, and the books she was reading, and the opinions she was forming about the world at large. He told her things she hadn't known about him, that he'd grown up on a failing farm in Kansas, that his father had been a hard man, not cruel exactly, but sealed in the way of men who didn't know how to talk about difficulty, and so carried it in silence until it became something heavier than silence. That he'd come to Wyoming at 19 with a horse and a bedroll, and the specific determination of someone who has decided that the life they were born into is not the life they're going to keep. "How did you know," Emma asked one evening, "that you could build something different?" "I didn't," he said. "I just knew I couldn't stay where I was." She thought about that. "That's where I was 2 years ago." "I know. Is it terrible that it took Richard leaving to get me there?" Luke was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, in the way he did when he was thinking something through completely before he said it. "I think," he said finally, "that sometimes the door only opens from the outside. Someone has to shut it on you before you discover you could have walked out on your own." Emma looked at him across the table. "That might be the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's just what I believe." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it honest." He looked at her then with an expression she'd been watching develop for months. Something that had moved past the careful restraint of the early weeks and the measured steadiness of the middle months into something fuller. Something that made no attempt to conceal itself. "Emma," he said. "Luke, I'd like to say something. And I want to say it plainly because I've learned from watching you that plain is better." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm not presenting conditions or timelines or expectations. I think you should know it, because you deserve to know when someone sees you clearly and chooses you completely." He held her gaze. "I see you clearly, and I choose you. Whatever that means to you, whatever shape it takes, that's what it is." The kitchen was very quiet. Emma felt the words move through her. Not like a shock, not like something she hadn't known was coming, but like the moment a key turns in a lock you've been carrying for so long you'd almost forgotten what it was for. She wasn't ready to say everything back. She knew that. She also knew with equal certainty that Luke would not need her to say everything back because he had just told her he wasn't asking for anything tonight. He had meant that. He always meant what he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you do." "That's enough for now," he said. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's more than I knew how to want for a very long time." The proposal happened in March on a hill north of the homestead, where the snow was just beginning to pull back from the grass, the first insistent green of a Wyoming spring, pushing up through the cold. Luke had taken her there on the pretext of looking at a section of fence line that ran along the property boundary, a pretext that was even thinner than his usual pretexts, since she could see from 20 yards away that the fence was perfectly sound. She had said nothing. She had walked beside him up the hill and stood with him at the top and looked out at the valley below the Whitfield Ranch to the north, her own homestead to the south, the thread of Harlow Creek catching the thin March light in the middle distance. "The fence is fine," she said. "Yes," he said. "Luke." "Yes." "Did you bring me up here to look at a fence that doesn't need looking at?" He turned to face her. He was not a man who performed moments, and he didn't perform this one. He simply looked at her with everything he had and said, "I want to build a life with you. Not take over your life. Not manage it or redirect it. Build alongside it." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, plain silver, a small stone that caught the light cleanly without any attempt at grandeur. "I want to be your partner, in every sense of that word. Equal ground. Equal say. Whatever you've built stays yours. Whatever we build together, we build together." He paused. "Emma Caldwell, will you marry me?" Emma looked at the ring. She looked at the valley. She looked at this man who had showed up with timber and measurements and a willingness to show her how the nail went in at an angle, and had never once in all the months since made her feel like anything less than exactly who she was. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, which she would think about later and realize had not been an accident. He had somehow, with characteristic, methodical attention, figured out the size. She didn't ask how. She just looked at it on her hand and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for so long she'd stopped noticing the unsteadiness. She looked up at him. "You measured my ring size somehow." "Clyde," he said. "Clyde. I asked him if he knew how I might work it out without asking you directly. He suggested looking at a ring you sometimes leave on the kitchen windowsill. I borrowed it briefly one Wednesday. I returned it before you came back inside." Emma stared at him. "You recruited Clyde into this?" He was honored to be asked. She laughed. It came out full and genuine, the laugh of a woman who has not run out of reasons to be surprised by this particular man. "That is the most you thing I've ever heard." "I needed accurate information," he said simply. "I wasn't going to guess on something that mattered." She took his face in her hands and kissed him there on the hill, with the spring coming in under the cold, and the valley spread out below them, and every ordinary beautiful piece of her life visible from where she stood. She thought Richard never once brought me somewhere simply to show me something good. She thought I didn't know this was what it was supposed to feel like. She thought nothing else for a while after that. They married in June on the longest day of the year. The ceremony was at the Grange Hall, the same room where Emma had stood 5 months earlier and asked Richard Caldwell a question he couldn't answer. She had thought about that, choosing a different venue, sidestepping the association. She had decided against it deliberately. The Grange Hall was her community's room. It belonged to all the moments that had happened inside it, the difficult ones and the good ones, and she was not going to let one man's exit from her life determine which spaces she got to occupy. The whole town came. That was the part Emma hadn't entirely anticipated, not just the people she expected, but everyone. The seamstress and the blacksmith's wife and the hotel manager and the courthouse clerk and Hanson from the general store with his wife on his arm. The Whitfield family in the front row. Carson Whitfield sitting with his arms folded, and the specific expression of a man who has watched something he approved of reach its correct conclusion. Clyde stood in the back of the room in his good shirt, which appeared to have been recently ironed, and when Emma walked in, he pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who is having a feeling he wasn't expecting to have and is managing it with dignity. Martha walked beside Emma as she came down the aisle. She was not performing the role of maid of honor. Emma was too old and too practical for titles that didn't reflect the actual relationship. She was simply Martha, her oldest friend, the woman who had sat at her kitchen table the morning. Everything fell apart and covered her hands and said, "You were not the problem." Walking beside her on the morning everything came together. "You look like yourself," Martha murmured halfway down the aisle. "Good," Emma murmured back. "That's exactly what I was going for." Luke was waiting at the front of the room with the same expression he'd had on the hill in March, open and complete, and making no attempt at restraint. He watched her come toward him, and she watched him watch her, and something passed between them that didn't require the ceremony to make it real. The ceremony was just the community's way of being present for what had already been decided quietly and entirely, in a kitchen and a yard and on a hill, and 100 ordinary Tuesday mornings over the course of a year and a half. The vows were simple. Emma had written her own, which caused a small stir of surprised interest in the room because women didn't generally do that, and Emma had decided she was done letting convention determine what she said on the most important occasions of her life. She looked at Luke, and she said, "I am not coming to you as someone who needs saving. I am coming to you as someone who knows her own value and has chosen to share it with someone who knows it too. I promise to work alongside you to tell you the truth, to trust your honesty, and to build something with you that neither of us could build alone, not because we lack the capability, but because it's better together. That's my promise. Equal ground. Every day." Luke looked at her throughout all of it without blinking. When it was his turn, he said, "I promise to see you clearly for the rest of my life. I promise never to ask you to be less than you are. And I promise that whatever I have, my work, my judgment, my time, my loyalty is yours. Completely and without condition. For as long as you'll have it." The room was very quiet. Then the minister said the words that needed to be said, and they were married, and the town of Harlow Creek exhaled in collective satisfaction. The part that shocked the town came 3 weeks later. People had assumed quietly automatically with the comfortable certainty of long-established custom that Emma would move to the Whitfield ranch. That was what you did. A woman married a man, and she moved into his world, and the previous chapter of her life folded up and became a story she told occasionally at dinner parties. Luke had his foreman's quarters at Whitfield's place. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also, Emma discovered when she and Luke sat down with the practical details of their new life, a conversation that had never actually needed to happen the way people expected it to. "I don't want to move," Emma said. "I want to keep the homestead." "Good," Luke said, "because I wasn't going to ask you to give it up." "You're not going to—" She stopped. "You're not surprised." "Why would I be surprised you built that property from nothing? It's in the rail corridor. It's producing income. It's yours." He looked at her with the simple directness she had come to understand was just how he was built right the way through. "I talked to Carson last month. He has a foreman's position that doesn't require on-site living. I'll keep the role but base from here. We can expand the operation, use your land and the Whitfield contract network together. We've been talking about it since February." Emma stared at him. "You've been planning this since February?" "March, actually, after the hill. You proposed to me and had already sorted out the property arrangement." "I wanted to be able to tell you there was a real plan," he said. "Not just a feeling. I know you work better with a real plan." She looked at him for a long moment. "Luke Mercer," she said, "you are the most organized man I have ever met in my life." "I find it reduces confusion later." She kissed him partly because she wanted to, and partly because it was the only response adequate to who he was. When the town found out, and it found out quickly, because Martha was constitutionally incapable of sitting on good information for more than 48 hours, the reaction was everything Emma might have hoped for. Confusion first, then surprise, then something that rippled through the community, like the revision of a story they'd all thought they knew the ending to. Emma Caldwell wasn't moving to her husband's place. Emma Caldwell was keeping her homestead, her deed her business, and her name. She had, after some discussion, decided to take Mercer as a second name, but keep Caldwell as well, a decision that caused the county recorder some mild clerical distress, and that Emma handled by simply explaining it twice until he wrote it down correctly. Luke Mercer was moving operations to the Caldwell homestead, expanding the ranch partnership, combining his network with her land and production capacity. They were building something together, as partners, with full documented, legally recorded co-ownership of the combined operation. The seamstress said she'd never heard of such a thing. The hotel owner said it was unusual, but he supposed it made practical sense. Carson Whitfield said it was the smartest business arrangement he'd seen in 30 years of ranching, and he wished he'd thought of it himself. Clyde, when informed of the complete situation, looked at the middle distance for a moment and then said, "Well, she always did price her preserves too low." He paused, until she didn't. By the fall of 1888, the Caldwell-Mercer operation was the most discussed agricultural partnership in Harlow County. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the most discussed because it was the one that didn't fit the template anyone had been working from, and people in Harlow Creek were finding somewhat to their own surprise that they admired it. Emma handled the production side, the preserves, the baked goods, the contracts, the accounts. She had expanded the kitchen garden and added a second chicken yard, and had taken on 2 women from town to help with the output, which she paid a fair wage and treated with the same directness she'd always brought to every working relationship. Luke handled the livestock side, cattle and horses, both using the Whitfield network and Emma's land access, and a reputation that had only grown through the months of publicly and quietly and completely standing behind Emma's decisions. They worked alongside each other every day. They argued sometimes practically and without theater about business decisions and resource allocation, and the one ongoing disagreement about whether the north pasture was better suited to cattle or to an expanded garden plot that would probably never be fully resolved. They talked every evening. They laughed more than Emma had laughed in 8 years of marriage to a man who had found her difficult. She thought about that, sometimes the version of herself who had stood in the kitchen on a hot July morning and heard the word "don't" and had felt something crack open. She thought about that woman with a tenderness that surprised her, because it would have been easier to be angry at her to look back at all the time she'd spent shrinking and wonder why it had taken so long to stop. But anger at yourself for surviving something the best way you knew how was a waste of energy, and Emma had become very precise about her energy. One evening in late October, with the harvest fully in and the accounts balanced and the first real cold of the season coming down from the north, Emma sat on the porch with Luke in the last of the daylight and looked out at the valley. Her valley, their valley. The thing they had built and were continuing to build in the particular ongoing way of real things that don't have a single finished state but are always becoming more of what they are. Luke had his arm around her shoulders, easy and warm, the way of 2 people who have learned the particular vocabulary of each other's physical presence over a year of proximity and chosen it deliberately. "Do you ever think about what you'd say to him?" Luke said. "If you saw him again?" Emma considered this honestly. "No," she said. "I don't think about Richard much at all." "That's probably healthy. It took a while to get there." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to run through it sometimes, in the first months, what I would say, what I should have said, all the arguments I'd lost by not knowing I was in one." She leaned slightly into his shoulder. "I stopped when I